Good afternoon. I'm Peter Berkowitz. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, which is headquartered at Stanford University. I and a few hardy colleagues man this outpost here in the belly of the beast, 2,500 miles from the safety and comfort of Palo Alto. The director of the DC office, Mike Frank, couldn't be here this evening. So on his behalf and on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I want to welcome you all to this special event on national security and foreign policy. My colleague, my West Coast colleague, Victor Davis Hanson, will be moderating the discussion and introducing our distinguished guests. As you all know, Victor is a world-renowned scholar of military history, especially classical military history, and a prolific and incisive and fearless commentator on contemporary conflict. As such, he's the perfect man to preside over this event. Victor.
Thank you very much. So much nicer than the last person who introduced me, who said, Victor Hanson, raisin farmer and former colleague of Jerry Tarkanian at Fresno State. But I appreciate that. This is the culmination of a day of the Hoover Working Group on Military History and Contemporary Conflict. We have 25 or so scholars that discuss issues during the day. And we thought we would just have about I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished guest, Elliott Abrams, former of the National Security Council, Council of Foreign Relations presently. I think that needs no introduction. And Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who I think a lot of us have sort of see as the new icon of foreign policy, at least I do. And I'll just introduce some broad topics and let them speak, and then we're going to turn it over to you and the audience for questions. Today, the group brought up this question that this administration does not seem committed in the same manner that other administrations since the post-war era, the last 70 years, both Democratic and Republican, to an internationalist role of American leadership abroad. We also discussed why that was, whether the Obama administration is a catalyst for that movement or simply a reflection of larger demographic or ideological or political currents in the United States that are also evident not just in the Pentagon, but also in the other candidacies of the Trump candidacy, or maybe perhaps the Cruz candidacy or the Sanders candidacy. And our concern was, is this our imagination? Is it rectifiable? Is it going to be sustainable? Or do you see this as an aberration? Maybe we could start with you, Senator, then we'll go to Elliott.
Well, first, I want to thank Hoover for holding this panel. It's very nice to join Victor and Elliott here and to be with my old teacher, Peter Berkowitz. Thank you all for coming as well. I think the Obama administration is certainly an aberration. Yep. There's no doubt about that. I do think it's rectifiable, though. The United States, for all of the challenges that we have, for all of the flaws of the Obama administration's policy over the last 7 years, still has by far the world's largest and strongest economy, by far the world's largest and strongest military. We still have a way of life, a legal, political, cultural way of life that is more attractive to more people around the world than any other country, not just today, but in human history. So I do think that it's rectifiable, but it has to be rectified. It has to be rectified by new statesmen. I suspect that it won't be pursued by the next administration, whoever that might be. There's only a handful of people who might be the next president of the United States. I suspect the ones who have a real chance of winning that race are going to change course because it's manifestly obvious that the course needs to be changed. Yeah. Just take the threat of transnational terrorism, whether in the form of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. The threat is growing. Their desire is obvious to attack the United States. You didn't need to tease this out from their actions. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, stated reportedly to American soldiers when he was released from detention in Iraq in the last decade, like most ISIS leaders, he was held by the United States, that I'll see you guys in New York. That's all you need to know about their desire, not just inferring it from their actions in Brussels, Paris, and so forth, but you can see from their actions they match desire increasingly with capability, and the pace of those attacks is increasing. And if one of those attacks happens here in the United States, it's going to lead to a radical change in course in our counterterrorism policy and the relationship we have with our allies and some of our adversaries, the way it did after 9/11. One thing I always say when people ask what we should do is you should ask yourself what you would do, what you would expect your president and your Congress to do in the wake of such an attack. And whatever that is, we should do it right now, today, to prevent such an attack from happening. So in the end, events are going to overtake this president's anomalous foreign policy over the last 70 years. It's been dedicated to stopping great power war. It's been dedicated to stopping a hegemon arising that can control the old world and project power against us in the new world. Given that we know that events, looking back at history, are going to overtake this anomalous policy, I think we should get ahead of events and adopt a policy to stop that from happening.
When you mean a terrorist event, you mean something of the magnitude that culls more Westerners from their herd than San Bernardino or Paris?
Something more in the magnitude of Brussels or Paris, or God forbid, something like 9/11 or more. I mean, the president thinks that we all, Americans as a whole, exaggerate and the threat of terrorism to our lives and overreact to these threats. He reportedly, if you believe Jeff Goldberg's article, compares the threat of terrorism to bathtub falls, in which more Americans die, or the threat of vehicular deer collisions. And we know a lot about that in Arkansas. You can't weaponize a bathtub fall. The deer aren't plotting in the woods to get chemical and biological weapons. They're just more or less kind of going about running into vehicles in the woods.
Lyme disease doesn't count.
No, but if terrorists are able to launch that kind of mass casualty attack, like happened in the Sinai to a Russian airliner, or something on the magnitude of Paris, the American people demand that their president and Congress change course radically and eliminate this threat. And we should whatever we would do in the aftermath of that attack, we should do right now to stop that attack from happening.
Elliott, do you want to expand on that, or in any way you feel that you'd like to? I don't know where this idea came from that we're in now, but I'll leave that to somebody else.
Let me begin by apologizing for my laryngitis. It gets better and worse as I go along. And my throat is so bad now, I sometimes sound like Hillary Clinton. But I won't shout it.
Well, you're not wearing leather today.
Nor under FBI investigation.
I like the word aberration because I think it's a really good explanation of the strangeness of this administration, which is a deviation from its predecessors. We've not had a president who thinks that we are the problem. We have not had a president who views it as his role to restrain us, the American people, from what would otherwise be childlike conduct and aggressive behavior. And that's been, I think, the story of the administration's foreign policy all along. We are the problem. So it isn't just getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the decline in military power. It's the sense that we don't need allies. Why do we need allies? Allies are nothing but trouble. Allies are people who ask you to do things. We don't want to do anything. And enemies, again, that's this childlike, old-fashioned behavior. We have enemies, we have misunderstandings, which can be reset. Well, I don't think this is an exaggeration. This is a policy that's really been followed for 7 years. And we've seen the impact, and one need only speak to any of the people who are dependent on the United States for their security, to some degree. Israelis, Jordanians, Saudis, Australians, South Koreans, Japanese, Czechs, Poles, they all have essentially the same view of current American foreign policy as a withdrawal from responsibilities that they felt we had accepted. It's very interesting in the Jeff Goldberg interview in The Atlantic. No one in the White House has said anything in that interview is wrong. They have not said anything was a misstatement. It's all, I therefore take it accurate. One of the things the president said in it that's so interesting, he cast aspersions on the stupid Washington idea of credibility. Now think of that, Think of a world which is, except to the extent that we have alliance relationships, which he is weakening, it's a Hobbesian world. Credibility is the measure of whether foreign governments can predict what the United States is going to do and depend on us. And if they are allies, that's a matter of life and death for many of them. And the president treats it as if it were a foolish intellectual creation of Washington think tank scholars. It's a complete misunderstanding, I think, of what's going on in the world, and it can only be explained, I would argue, by a very strong ideology that holds that his job as president, to go back where I started, is to restrain the United States from what would otherwise be dangerously aggressive military actions.
Yeah. I agree. I think he thinks the post-war order that led to globalization was not necessarily a beneficial phenomenon for a lot of people that he feels that he's a champion or a spokesman for, self-appointed though it may be. And he also feels it was a diversion of precious resources from social programs that he wants to now reinvest to their full measure. Now that we've talked about platitudes, what areas of the world in this vacuum do these regional hegemons feel they have, 10 months left to take advantage of this? Reminds me of the annus terribilis of Jimmy Carter in 79, 80, when suddenly China was in Vietnam and Afghanistan was invaded by the Russians. Central America had the communists, and we had, of course, the Shah and the hostages. Do you see in the next 10 months a especially scary time, do you think? And where will people, North Korea, Iran, or Russia, Middle East, where are you most worried? Either one of you.
Well, let me, before my voice goes entirely.
There's a surfeit of answers, so his answer first won't take away from anything I can answer.
Well, the president, of course, gave Ukraine to Vladimir Putin in that interview. I mean, it was really extraordinary. Historians debate still whether Atchison actually meant to draw the defense line in a way that wouldn't defend South Korea, but and whether that contributed to the decision to invade. But this was really extraordinary. You had the President of the United States saying, "Oh, Ukraine, Ukraine. Hopeless. Hopeless. There's nothing we can do. They are in the Russian zone." I mean, this is really interesting for those of us who have been through, remember the debate about Finlandization?
Yeah.
Well, obviously that, the argument from the president is Finland is in their zone. My answer to your question, what do I worry about, is if I were Putin, it seems to me I've got 1 year with Obama, and I've got maybe 5 until the economy more or less collapses. I mean, the economic and demographic situations are poor. So where would I go? Having done Georgia, pretty much gotten away with it freely. Having done Ukraine, there are a few sanctions, but not much. Having done Syria and been thanked for it. Having been told that we don't care, this is really what the president said, we don't care about Eastern Europe, we don't care about the former Soviet states. The question would be, do you try something in Moldova, or do you try something in one of the Baltic states, which are NATO members? Because maybe we react and maybe we don't. And if we don't, you have destroyed NATO, which is one of the great Russian achievements, something that the Soviets could not do, Putin would have done.
Yeah.
I think Elliott's right that Vladimir Putin is probably the most likely source of ongoing conflict or instability. I mean, he's got a weak hand if you look at the status of his economy and his population and some of the social problems they have in that country, but he's continued to play it very well. And some of the places Elliott mentioned, Moldova's got its own serious corruption problems. And the fighting continues to in Ukraine. I think that, and I thought for several months that the common scenario you see sketched, the kind of hybrid warfare from Crimea being transplanted into Estonia or Latvia is high reward because it would maybe fracture NATO, but it's also very high risk, maybe even too high risk for Vladimir Putin. But if one of his grand geopolitical objectives is to divide the West, especially divide the United States from Europe, and to try to establish greater hegemony in Eastern and Central Europe, where he can deal with countries on a one-off basis, the intervention in Syria actually makes a lot of sense because he's been able to turn up the temperature over the last 9 months on the migrant crisis that Europe faces. and I was in Europe last month, and we met with a lot of the countries' leaders who are on the so-called land route from the Middle East, and it's a state of near panic. Similar state of near panic in Northern European countries where these migrants are ending up and the resource drain they're committing against those countries. And Vladimir Putin knows that. I don't think that was an unintended consequence of the intervention. I think it was very much an intended. May have been a second order consequence to other objectives he had in Syria and the Middle East, but I think it was very much intended. And as winter turns to spring and spring turns to summer, I wouldn't be surprised to see that pressure turned up even more, to include meddling with the various factions of Kurdish politics in Syria and then in Turkey as well, which is, after all, a NATO member. So I think Vladimir Putin is probably the most likely source over the next 10 months to take advantage of President Obama's retreat from the world. Now, that said, I also do fear that a serious terror attack, most likely by the Islamic State, is a possibility. There are gaps, serious gaps in Western intelligence, more so in Europe than in the United States, for a whole variety of reasons we could get into, but the pace of these attacks are accelerating, and the intent of the Islamic State to conduct such attacks is clear, and they like to attack, I mean, they're perfectly happy to attack things like airports and concert halls and movie theaters and county office buildings, whereas Al-Qaeda traditionally focused more on the grand symbolic objectives like the Pentagon, the Capitol, the World Trade Centers, which means there were fewer targets and they took longer, more planning, whereas an attack at a high school graduation or a college football game takes much less.
When you look at the Iranian deal, and the President in the last 48 hours said he felt that it had violated the spirit but not the letter of the accord, and given that it wasn't passed through the Senate, and given the Iranian hijacking of a small American boat, the shooting of a missile next to an American carrier, some cyber attacks, the smuggling of arms to Yemen, do you think the next president will say de facto that the accord is off? Is that the best way to handle it because of Iranian behavior, or do you just, it seems to me that in the next 10 months they're going to give us plenty of reasons why we feel that they didn't live up to the accord? Or
I mean,
you have to be passive, or can you just?
They've already given us plenty of reason. This is not complicated. You know, what the rest of the world, but especially the Sunni Arab world, sees is Iran shooting off missiles and kidnapping our sailors and violating the Geneva Conventions by broadcasting those images of them, and the United States responding by paying Iran even more to stick to the nuclear deal, no matter what they do in their campaign of regional aggression and support for terrorism. I mean, it's a simple fact. It's the way the world sees it.
And this is predicated on the idea that we won't do any, either
that we care a lot more about the nuclear deal than Iran does, and therefore we will continue to pay more than we're required to pay under the nuclear deal itself. Like the debate that's ongoing right now about the so-called dollarizing of Iranian transactions. These are things that Jack Lew and Adam Zubin testified specifically to the Congress about, saying it would not happen. And now you've got Jack Lew out giving speeches saying that we have to be accommodating. We have to make sure Iran gets all the benefits of that deal, when we should be out cautioning Western countries and companies from rushing into Iran because of changes to that deal that may happen in 8 months from now. So I think it's hard to predict what the facts on the ground will be in late January of next year. At an absolute minimum, the next president needs to substantially revise the obligations that Iran has under that deal. They need to confront Iran's regional aggression in all of its forms. And if Iran doesn't like that, then we simply say that the deal is off, and either you eliminate your nuclear program or we will.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a corner now for the rest of the Obama administration. Why do we have this deal? And why is it quite so bad as it is? For example, on the missile question, it seems that actually happened at the very end. The last few days, the Iranians loaded on this. No, ballistic missiles are out of this. You have to remove what had previously been a ban. They did it because they knew they could. They knew that there was close to nothing that they could do that would push Kerry and Obama away from the table. Well, okay, now you have the deal, and if anything, it's worse. This is the great achievement of the administration. I guess the president said in the Atlantic interview, his other great achievement was not enforcing his red line on Syria, of which he's very proud. Which, I mean, think of that for a minute. There are 350,000 people dead, and there are 8 million refugees, and he is proud. he doesn't say, he doesn't say, look, there wasn't, it's like Tibet. I wish we could liberate Tibet. What can we realize? No, he's proud of this. And he's most proud of the nuclear deal. So there is close to nothing the Iranians can do. I mean, at one point, I think we might have said,
Maybe they get a bomb, huh?
What if they capture an American boat in the Gulf? I think we would have said, oh, well, that's close to the line. There is no line. There is nothing, I think, realistic that would lead him away from that deal. That is his pride and joy.
Yeah, and the failure to enforce the red line, which is a key theme of that article. This is when the president felt liberated from the Washington foreign policy establishment, which he referred to as, supposedly, if you believe the article, as Israeli and Arab occupied territory on Massachusetts Ave. So I guess you're safe here on New York Ave. But it made him appear so weak. And this is not just me opining, this is what I have heard from heads of state, foreign ministers, ambassadors, and not just in the Sunni Arab world, but around the world, places that you don't think have their regional political situations and security situations influenced by what happens in the Levant. But for the president, he thinks it was a crowning achievement, when in reality, the substance of power has a lot to do with its reputation and appearance. And right now, because of President Obama's actions, first in the red line, but continued on since then in the Middle East, the rally of American power is substantially diminished because of the appearance and reputation for American power.
Historically, deterrence is slowly acquired and then easily lost and then very dangerously reacquired. And that was what happened. Remember when Reagan came into office, people demonized him as wanting nuclear winter and all of this to try to restore the sense of U.S. credibility. In a place, say, that with the Spratly Archipelago and what China's done with the artificial islands, to take one example, what would a president do to correct? I mean, would he have to come in and say that whole concept, not just of claiming territorial airspace and waters, but what you did just doesn't work in the international community, and you got to get out? And is that?
It's probably too late to go back to recognizing Taiwan as the real China.
Are those the real islands now?
Yeah. Well, the point you made is, I think, the right one. That is that reversing any of this is hard. It's easy not to sign a crummy deal with Iran. It is hard now to round up the allies again, to see if we can reimpose sanctions and change the deal. It's obviously worth doing, but it's much harder. I think the question here is to put significant doubt in the minds of those who would possibly engage in acts of aggression. Putin, the Chinese, the Iranians. I think they have no doubt now. They're pretty sure that they're safe for the next year. And so it certainly means beefing up our presence. I think it's easier, frankly, to see how to do that in Eastern Europe, where the presence of American soldiers on the ground in Poland or in the Baltic states is itself, in the old NATO sense, a tripwire.
Yeah.
That will, I think, stop Putin. I don't know what can be done here except to enlarge the American naval presence and do more aggressive patrolling. The administration likes to claim that it's doing that, but I think actually if you look at the number of patrols and exactly where they're patrolling, they're really being very careful not to challenge the Chinese.
And I'd say, and it's not just the number, which is very low, but it's also the hemming and hawing and the hand-wringing about the patrols we're doing. There's esoteric distinctions in the law of the seas about innocent passage versus freedom of navigation operations, and you hear different explanations for what they're doing from different elements of the administration. A few months ago when they did the first one of these passages near one of the artificial islands that China has constructed, people in Washington celebrated, but it wasn't followed on by many more. And also there was this hand-wringing about just how aggressive a patrol it was. Going back earlier, we should have been more supportive of all of our allies, not to try to have a military solution. That's not great whenever you have a bunch of countries with claims over these reefs in the South China Sea, fighting it out at sea, but using international courts of arbitration, which China doesn't like. but which, for instance, the Philippines has done. We shouldn't have been trying to restrain them behind the scenes, and we should have taken more actions like we did with Japan in the East China Sea 3 years ago when we, along with Japan, didn't recognize China's asserted air defense identification zone. There's more things that we could do, like acknowledge that our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines extends to their claims in the South China Sea.
I'm going to open it up to the audience, but I just want to ask one question because both of you see a lot more foreign leaders than most of us do. And I think the American public was nursed on the idea that in the Bush administration, we were advocates of, we were a hyperpower, we were advocates of unilateralism, and we were not multilateral. Now when you go and talk to foreign leaders, we don't need to name any names, is there any sense of, I shouldn't have wished for what I got what I wished for?
Sure. I mean, it's obvious in the Arab world, and I think it's obvious in Asia. It's less obvious in Europe, in part because Bush was unpopular among most European publics for the whole time he was in office. But if you talk to the leaders now, they're wishing for the good old days.
It's funny because if I could, when you have Francois Hollande's statement about Islamic terrorism momentarily bleeped out, or you're told in the interview that Cameron it was his fault because he didn't bring the Parlement along, or Sarkozy was showboating. Does that resonate in your? Do people? What's the reaction on it?
Oh, I think it does. I mean, and again, if I'm not talking about public opinion here.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
But I would say elite foreign policy opinion, particularly at the top, they feel they have no real relationship with the United States anymore. I mean, if you remember the question was asked a couple of years ago, who are the president's friends among foreign leaders? And the answer that was given a couple of years ago was Erdogan. Okay, that answer is not given anymore for obvious reasons. Now they don't give an answer. There isn't one. There isn't one. And you can, think of the Europeans and the Mexicans and the Canadians. And I have heard remarkable number of national security advisors say to me, I don't really have anybody to talk to. So they're wishing for the good old days.
Yeah, we hear the same thing. I mean, from big countries that are powerful, that were most opposed to some of the actions of the Bush administration, that wish they had less America. You hear that they maybe went a little too far in that direction. They'd like a little more America going forward. In the Congress, we hear in particular a lot from small countries. And small countries are inherently vulnerable, whether they're in Eastern Europe or the Balkans, whether they're in the Middle East, whether they're in East Asia. And to a large part, their existence as a nation depends on U.S. security guarantees.
And what are they saying? Are they mystified, or what do they think the cause of all this is? Can they figure it out?
They think that, small countries in the Middle East versus East Asia versus Europe have different views of that. I mean, like in the Middle East, I think they feel vindicated now by Jeff Goldberg's article about the president that he wants to retreat from the Middle East. He thinks the U.S. has been overinvested there for decades, that we have fewer and fewer interests as we develop our own oil and gas resources in this country, that our allies there are largely a source of trouble and pain and commitments, and our enemies are enemies largely because of misbehavior of the United States in the past, and that therefore we're going to abandon some of these countries, some of whom have just 1 million or 2 people, citizens, with small armed forces, while they're looking up at a giant 80 million person Persian country with an advanced military and developing nuclear weapons capability. And then without the U.S. security guarantee, without the framework for international security that the United States has led for 70 years, they have real fears. I mean, that's something that's hard for a lot of Americans, even elite foreign policy leaders in America, to understand. It's a dangerous world out there.
I would just add, the question I sometimes get really comes down to, do we have an Obama problem or do we have an America problem? That is a concern that, explain Trump, explain Sanders. Is there really an isolationist tendency in the United States that's growing in strength? Is Obama actually, is that view more popular than we would perhaps fear? So I think that concern is very much out there.
Especially when they look at the election and they see people that voice similar views.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if anybody would like to, from the audience back there.
Senator, since you obviously had combat experience, a whole lot of this, the actions that have occurred, for instance, with the capture of the naval, the boats, reflected their understanding or their orders in the rules of engagement. And my question, I'd like for you to comment on how the philosophy at the top has bled down, and I use that purposefully, has bled down into the ground level military action. Who established those rules of engagement that eventually got our sailors captured? Who establishes those things, and why do they?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the responsibility for that rests with the commander-in-chief, the president. There's lots of levels between that, but especially in today's battlefield, the corporal line on the front lines can undertake a strategic action, whether that's a strategic victory or a strategic defeat. I don't want to get into the details too much of the seizure of those two boats, except to say, because there's an ongoing investigation, but I will say that by all public accounts, they were not seized by large destroyers or cruisers. They were seized by similar ships, and they did have 50 caliber machine guns on them. You hear from members of the anti-ISIS coalition about the restraints that their own pilots have on striking oil facilities or oil trucks for the longest period of time. There are policy debates here in Washington in 2014 when Israel was in the middle of a shooting war and the Pentagon was undergoing routine resupply of munitions that Israel needs, and administration officials in the White House learned of this and they revoked that authority and held it in their own hands as a matter of policy. So the signal that this sends, whether you're dealing with a private out on patrol in Afghanistan or Iraq, whether you're dealing with sailors in the Persian Gulf, or whether you're dealing with senior military peer-to-peer relations in the counter-ISIS coalition, is that the president is very reluctant to use military power to achieve national objectives. You don't have to there doesn't have to be a choice between no military action and 150,000 heavy mechanized troops on the ground like we had 10 years ago in Iraq. There's lots of limited applications of military power that can achieve national objectives, as Vladimir Putin has just shown in Syria over the last 9 months.
We had another question right here with Todd. In the front here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So, Elliott, is it an Obama problem or is it an America problem? And by the way, since we're on the what is the role of individual in history question, is it a Putin problem or is it a Russia problem?
So this takes 2 hours, right? We don't have 2 hours. So I'm inclined to think we have an Obama problem. I was actually more fearful several years ago about growing isolationism and the potential candidacy of Rand Paul. And then when ISIS beheaded 3 Americans, the Rand Paul campaign was over. And I think for terrorist reasons alone, it's going to be impossible to persuade the American people that isolationism is a safe policy. I do think also that much of the bad leadership we see by the president, the lack of appreciation of the importance of alliances is idiosyncratic. It doesn't represent the Democratic Party. The failure to understand that diplomacy is not a talk shop. Diplomacy is part of the application of all elements of national power to solve problems and to protect your security. He doesn't get that. I actually think Hillary Clinton gets that. So I think he is, we'll go back, an aberration, even among Democrats. Sanders, the popularity of Sanders has to be explained, and it may actually reflect the unpopularity of Hillary Clinton, which I wouldn't think is primarily for foreign policy reasons. But do we have a Russia problem or a Putin problem? We're going to have a Russia problem until Russia becomes a stable democratic country. Now that may take a century. And if it takes a century, we're going to have a Russia problem for a century, because it is natural for any Russian dictator to do what I would say the Iranians are also doing, and the Chinese are doing. It's an old story we know from the Soviet Union. You try to use shock and awe overseas to convey to the people of the country, you can't change things. We are too powerful. And it is in that sense that I think it's very clear that what the Reagan administration did in places like Nicaragua and above all Afghanistan contributed very much to the decline and fall of the Soviet Empire, because it gave the impression, no, they're not invulnerable. So I think that a Putin, a successor to Putin, who has to persuade the people of Russia how tough he is and how great he is and how invulnerable he is always going to look for foreign adventures.
And I would like to answer the first part of that question, that I think it's a Barack Obama problem. It's not an American people problem. The media, which is behind the story, as they often are, still likes to say that the American people are war-weary. If that's true, if it ever was true, it shouldn't be surprising when their commander-in-chief is the weariest of them all. And when it comes in particular to foreign policy and national security policy, the president is uniquely positioned as the commander-in-chief to influence public opinion. The president of any party is unlikely to argue the American people in and out of a deeply held conviction like matters of gun control. He's unlikely to argue them in or out of their perception of the economy, no matter what the BLS says on the first Friday of every month, if their brother-in-law is out of a job, or if their kid had to move back in with them after college because he can't find a job. But he is uniquely capable. I mean, we're all, as elected leaders, more capable on foreign policy to inform and persuade the American people about the state of the world. But the president is the most uniquely situated because he's the only national leader. He's the commander-in-chief. And I've seen this time and time again. People are willing to listen. They're willing to change their viewpoint based on new information. Even people who, there's probably some very sophisticated businessman in this audience that does a lot of business in Western Europe or in Latin America or in China. And you may be an expert on that area. Well, you're not an expert on all the other parts of the world. So the commander-in-chief is uniquely positioned. And the example I would give for this is a few months ago when the president announced that he was going to maintain troop levels in Afghanistan, which has our forces just hanging on by their fingertips. But at least he didn't cut them even further. And this was perceived by the media to be a controversial decision because the president was reversing course from what he had announced a few years ago. There was one day of headlines, and then it went away. No one has cast a vote on that in any election. No one will. I submit that he could have had the same situation in Iraq in 2011, or maybe even 2009 after his first review, but especially in 2011, if he had said, I was the anti-war candidate, I opposed this Iraq war, we shouldn't have started, I still believe that in 2003, but given where we are in 2011, given all of the gains we've made over the last 4 years, keeping 15,000 troops in Iraq, not to kick down doors and shoot bad guys, but to train the Iraqi military, to provide support capabilities like aviation and intelligence and logistics, to provide more leverage on the coalition government. I think it would have been a one-day controversy in the news, and then it would have gone away. And you know what wouldn't have happened? The Islamic State wouldn't have had the time, the space to reconstitute itself from al-Qaeda in Iraq and begin its campaign of terror across the Middle East and Europe and the United States. So in the end, it would have cost less. In fact, we might end up, the president might go out of office with more troops in Iraq than he would have if he had just accepted the commander's recommendations at the time, to much greater political cost than he ultimately would have faced if he had taken their advice at the time.
That was ironic because in 2004, when he was running for Senate, he said he had no serious disagreements with the Bush administration at that point. And then Joe Biden said Iraq had the potential to be the administration's greatest achievement. He said that in 2010. And then the president himself said, I'm happy to leave behind a self-reliant and secure Iraq at the end of 2000.
Well, and one reason why I think he made the decision a few months ago to reverse course on Afghanistan is because of the catastrophic effects of his Iraq policy. And so many people were drawing the parallel between what we did in Iraq in 2011 and what he was proposing to do in Afghanistan in 2015 and 16.
One thing about the Atlantic Monthly article was, and I think you hit it, there was no self-doubt. It was a congratulatory tour of the world as if it was 1938 and Neville Chamberlain was our tour guide. That everything was pretty calm and we should, because nobody was actually shooting anybody, so these movements would would end on their own. We had a question right there, and then we'll try to get.
I would argue that Donald Trump has lit the kindling on illegal immigration. Congress hasn't really done much in 10 years. Is that a problem, and is it a national security problem?
So Congress hasn't done much in 30 years. Since the last time they passed major immigration legislation, which was modeled on the last major effort 3 years ago, which was amnesty first and enforcement later, which really means enforcement never, given our history. Congress has passed repeated laws to build a fence on our southern border, which we don't have. A lot of European countries are building those fences now because they face the threat of illegal immigration, and it is a national security threat there, and it can be here as well. It is a real risk, and that's why I strongly favor building a fence on our southern border. We have other threats as well, though. We now have some doubts, reasonably so, about the quality of Belgian security services. There are estimates that a few hundred to a few thousand Europeans have traveled to the Middle East to train with the Islamic State and then returned through the migrant flows. Are we confident that the Belgian services, and every other service for that matter, knows every single one of their citizens that went to the Middle East and returned? And if we're not confident, then aren't there some what you might call clean terrorists who've been in the Middle East, who have received that training, who are sitting in countries like Belgium or like France or like Austria that can travel to the United States under the visa waiver program without undergoing any serious background check? So our immigration system does have real gaps in it, and it does pose a real security threat, in addition to all the economic problems that it's created as well.
We had a question with Walter Russell Mead here.
It's great listening to two of the most interesting people in American, for three of the most interesting people in American foreign policy.
We're the finalists to replace the Dos Equis beer guy.
So, when I look around the world and think about the next 10 months, one of the places that maybe worries me the most, and I think Washington may have thought the least about constructively, would be Europe, where the NATO alliance is fragile, the EU still hasn't recovered from the euro. I think in some ways Turkey has now become politically separated from NATO in some rather dangerous ways, but is still a member of the alliance. We've seen in the Caucasus the last few days the flare-ups with Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Putin sort of quietly backing one side, Turkey another. Feels almost like the Balkans in 1914. But my question really is, how do you guys think we should handle, or the next president should handle, the problem of this European breakdown of what has historically been our best alliance, our strongest relationship, and especially maybe when the establishment in both parties has been sort of, for various reasons, suggesting that the U.S. can distance itself a bit from Europe. Where do we go from here?
Let's start.
So one, having more U.S. engagement in Europe. I mean, the president and his senior administration officials for years were calling Europe a net exporter of security, speaking bureaucratic jargon. I think it's safe to say now that Europe is no longer a net exporter of security, but rather needs security to be imported to some degree, and we have to provide that under the guise of NATO in particular. And we're going to have to continue to bolster NATO's defenses. Donald Trump was wrong, in my opinion, when he said that we should reduce NATO spending, but he did have the kernel of an underlying truth, which is that Europe continues to underinvest in NATO. In the Cold War, it was 50-50. It's now about 70-30. So rather than us cutting our spending, though, we should be encouraging European countries to increase their spending. And some of them are moving in the right direction, but not rapidly enough. There are real intelligence gaps in Europe, and some of that is hard to overcome versus the United States. I mean, obviously, this is one instance where having a big ocean between us and the migrant problem is very helpful. And Europe has the challenge, but they should be building fences to stop the migrants from coming in. Chancellor Merkel should reverse course and saying we're not going to have an Ali oxen-free policy anymore, that if you get into Austria or Germany, you can just stay forever. That's, when people leave Syria and get into Turkey, they're refugees. When they leave Turkey and go further north, they're migrants. And Europe can't handle all the world's problems. We need to help train their services more effectively. You heard a lot of commentary after the Brussels attacks about we got to share more information. We need to share more intelligence. One of those things that politicians and pundits say a lot whenever one of these attacks happens. They don't really know what to say. You can't share intelligence unless you collect intelligence. And Europe puts too many restraints on our ability to collect intelligence in Europe, and they have too many objections to the way we collect intelligence in places around the world, to include Guantanamo Bay. So we have to take them, and we have to be willing to share what we collect, but also do so in a way that expands our capabilities of collection and also coaches them on what they need to bring to the table. I mean, they don't often know necessarily the information they need to bring to marry up to our information. So those are just a few of the things that we could and should be doing right now. A lot of those are big bites of the apple, I understand. But for the next 10 months, I think they're all pretty important.
I'm a little bit optimistic about what happens after that, because I think there is a perception on the part of the Europeans, much more now than certainly 10 years ago, of how dangerous it is for them when the Americans fail to provide leadership. So I think if an American president seeks to do that, there's an open door. Now, I do think we have something coming very soon that we're going to have to worry about and adjust to, even if we like it, and that is the British exit. This kind of weaponization of refugees that has produced the terrible problems on the continent, I think, I cannot prove this, but it seems right to me, makes a no vote more likely. I think more Brits look at Europe and say, no thanks, it's getting worse, not better. If that happens, one of the things it means is that NATO is even more important. And all the sort of probably foolish dreams of an EU force of any kind are over. But I think there will be an appetite for the strengthening of NATO from really almost any American president who wants to do that. Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the terrorism problem, I mean, there's the Russia problem. These are all places where we have a lot of common interests, and I don't think I think an American president can do that. I am struck by the degree to which we come back so much to the question of leadership.
I'd say if I could, to go back to, since you mentioned the weaponization of migration, it's also incumbent upon European leaders to actually listen to their voters. I mean, it's incumbent upon American leaders to listen to our voters, and maybe the Republican Party hasn't done that enough in the last 5 or 10 years or so, and that's why we are where we are today. But there's a rise of right-wing, some you might fairly call extreme right-wing. I think some of them are just right-wing parties in Europe that are having success not just at the regional level but at the national level, because European elites have ruled out of bounds any conversation about immigration and national culture and identity in countries that only have a couple million people that are ethnically, culturally, linguistically homogenous, and that had to go through a lot of war and ethnic cleansing and genocide over the last century to get that way. And the political correctness in Europe to rule those topics out of bound has led in part to the rise of some of these politicians who also tend to be a lot more pro-Russia. So Russia gets it coming and going with the migrant crisis. They are destabilizing a lot of EU countries, and they're helping lead to the rise of EU politicians who are going to be more pro-Russia when it comes time to renew sanctions or when it comes time to negotiate gas deals and so forth. So, I mean, we have a big role to play, obviously, but European leaders also have to take stock of what their people are telling them time and time and time again. You know, the voters can be ignored for a while, but ultimately, if there's a real and legitimate concern among your people and political elites and both parties are not addressing them, then some new leaders and parties are going to rise that will address them.
You mentioned Turkey, and I think the Obama pressure to admit Turkey as an EU member is dead. The special relationship with Erdogan is dead, and we probably green-lighted a lot of extremism that's taking place under the neo-Ottomanization of Turkey. And it also raises the issue of NATO, because we didn't issue, no country in NATO invoked Article 4 of consultation by the entire body throughout the entire Cold War. It's only been invoked 5 times, and 4 of them have been by Turkey. And the idea that we would come to the aid of a very valuable ally that has extremely invaluable basis for us, but the idea that we would get on their side in some of their new enemies is absurd. So I think it frames that relationship was a disaster, that special relationship that Obama cultivated, but it also brings up this problem with NATO. And you mentioned Donald Trump, and the frustrating thing about Donald Trump is that usually the solutions are scary, but he brings up a topic that he has an uncanny ability that knows has not been addressed. And that's a classical Athenian demagogue, and it's very effective. You had a question?
Senator Cotton, Mr. Abrams, my name's TJ. I'm a student at GW. I had a question. In the Goldberg article, President Obama seemed to think that the Islamic State wasn't an existential threat to the United States, and for that reason, it wasn't that important. Do you believe the Islamic State today to be an existential threat to the United States?
I would say no. Look, you can hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Islamic State is not an existential threat even to Israel. It's sitting there right on the border. It's a highly effective terrorist group, but it's not an existential threat to us. The threat is from significant acts of terrorism. As long as they don't have their hands on weapons of mass destruction, and so far they don't, I wouldn't call it an existential threat.
Yeah, I mean, to be exact, existential threats are countries like Russia that have the nuclear forces capable of destroying our way of life.
And maybe soon Iran.
Ending the human race, and soon Iran. But as Elliott said, if the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda gets their hands on weapons of mass destruction, then they could certainly inflict massive casualties on our society and perhaps change the way we live because of those attacks. And it appears that they were casing the joint at a Belgium nuclear reactor, that they were casing the home of the director of those nuclear facilities. I don't think they were doing that, because they wanted to go shoot up the cafeteria at the nuclear reactor. They could go shoot up cafeterias anywhere else. They were doing it because uranium and plutonium are in those things. And even if you can't have a working bomb, you can still have a dirty bomb that could have massive consequences. But again, this goes back to the point I was making about the deer collision and the bathtub falls. That, according to that article, the president routinely makes this point that the Islamic State is not an existential threat. The American people exaggerate the threat it poses to them. We need to, help them be more mature and understand that this is just like bathtub falls. This, the way he behaved in Cuba was not, it wasn't a bug. It was a feature. When he went to a baseball game and did the way with a communist dictator, when Americans were murdered, maimed, and still missing. And then he did an interview on ESPN wearing $400 sunglasses, talking about how Big Papi, David Ortiz, the designated hitter for the Red Sox, went out after the Boston massacre or Boston Marathon bombings and said, we're going to keep playing this game the day after Patriots Day to show the terrorists that they can't win by causing us to cancel games. Big Papi's job is to hit home runs and beat the Yankees. The president's job is to keep America safe. But it goes to show his mindset, that it's more important that he be seen doing the way with Raul Castro and doing an interview with Derek Jeter on ESPN than go to our embassy and monitor the situation in Brussels as the commander-in-chief.
We promised everybody that we would have a reception afterwards, and this would last an hour. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. We'll have Max, and then one here.
Granted that the president has made big mistakes in Syria, the question I have for you all is, what should we do in Syria now, and what should the in-state in Syria look like? What should we aim for as the in-state in Syria?
Well, obviously the choices of 2016 and 17 are worse than the choices of 2012, a lot worse. When the president said no to the advice he had gotten about building non-jihadi rebel forces, I still think that's the way to go. One of the president's specialties is condescension and contempt for anyone who disagrees with him, starting with the American people. But remember his comment about the Syrian rebels, pharmacists. Well, the pharmacists are still there and they're still fighting. And they haven't even all gone over to al-Nusra or to ISIS or to Al-Qaeda. They're out there, and they're getting a small amount of American and other help. I still think that that is what we ought to be doing because, look, what are the choices here? Who is going to rule Syria? One choice is Assad. This is a very bad choice for the obvious reasons, partly because he's an Iranian and Russian ally, partly because he's a mass murderer and a war criminal. ISIS is another choice. What else? Well, there ought to be another choice. Syria was a 75% Sunni country. It is not unthinkable to organize Sunni groups in that country, which exist, so that there is a choice beyond Assad and ISIS. Much harder now than a few years ago, but I still think that is the most sensible path for us to take. Now, what will Syria look like? Hard to envision a kind of unified Syria fully ruled from Damascus. So to have a kind of, Kurdistan, Alawistan, Sunnistan, with some international presence on the ground to help reduce the level of violence, I think is really the best you can envision for the next decade.
I don't have much to add to what Elliott said. I would say the question is not what should we do now. The question is what should we do 10 months from now, because the president's not going to do anything different.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're waiting for this president to change course, you're going to be waiting for a very long time because it's not going to happen. And there could be substantial changes to the facts on the ground in Aleppo in the north or in Dara in the south or the Islamic State's position or the Islamic State's ability to project attacks against the West in the meantime. So the question really becomes what happens early next year. Second, I would just say that if we expect our allies, countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have said that they would commit more ground troops with more U.S. leadership to the fight against the Islamic State, we have to accommodate their interests to a greater degree. We can't continue to give them the cold shoulder. We can't continue to conciliate with Iran and expect countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to help us defeat the Islamic State in Syria. It's just not going to happen. I mean, expecting Iran to help in any way against the Islamic State or Syria or Assad, for that matter, is like expecting gasoline to douse a fire.
We had one in the back. Yes, and then I think we'll have a reception at that point.
Thank you for your time today. Matt Dalton, Defense Fellow. My question is pertaining to Egypt. I'd like to know.
Could you hold your microphone up, please?
I'd like to know if you think we've wasted an opportunity to leverage the Egyptian leadership right now. They're home to such a large Arab population, that nation. They have a president who has challenged the religious leaders in that country to promote tolerance and to promote moderation. Yet it doesn't seem like we've done anything to show our support for him or for that action. And what can we do moving forward to help strengthen that partnership?
Elliott's the Egypt expert here, so I'll let him take the bulk of the question. I'll just say that we missed a lot of opportunities in Egypt over the last 7 years, and a lot of the mistrust of this president in Sunni states is rooted in part in how the president treated Mubarak in 2011 in the early days of the Arab Spring. President al-Sisi has given some very needed remarks about the need for reform of Islam from inside of Islam. At the same time, levels of political repression are pretty high, and I say that you don't have to be a moralist to say that up on your high horse. You can say that it's impractical and unwise for him, just as a matter of his own internal governance ability, that he can't have that level of repression and not avoid the fate of Morsi and Mubarak before him, and that we don't want to see that fate. We want to see Egypt succeed and move back towards a prosperous country that is secure and that is a reliable ally of the United States.
Well, I agree with that. I think, in fact, he gave one really good speech about moderation in Islam. He hasn't done anything. He just sort of dropped it after that. And what he is doing really is making sure that whether you are a journalist, editor, lawyer, imam, if you criticize him, you go to jail. And that's not a formula for stability, particularly in a country with no economic reform and no economic progress. And why is there no economic progress and reform? Because the army owns half the economy. And Sisi knows that he can be removed by the army just the way Mubarak was removed by the army if things get rough. Today, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia was supposed to announce, because King Salman is visiting Egypt, a $20 billion program for Egypt over 5 years. That's $4 billion a year in petroleum, free petroleum. $4 billion a year. Last year was $15 billion. The year before that, it was $15 billion. Now, partly that's because Saudis don't have the money they once had, but it's partly a lack of confidence in the way Sisi is governing, both from a political and from an economic point of view. I would say, I mean, you would know a lot more about this than I do, but the impression I have is that the terrorist situation in Sinai is worse today than it was the day Sisi became president. You may be able to say you can't blame him for the problems in the Western Desert, that's Libya. But in Sinai, he hasn't been able to figure out what to do. It's one of the reasons we talked about fences. The Israelis are building quite a big fence there to solve their own terrorism and immigration problem. But we just, I think we do not have in Sisi a really reliable partner. When I go to Israel, they hate me for saying this, because he is a reliable partner when it comes to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. But it seems to me we don't have to get up on a high horse. I would use the word legitimacy, not the word in this case. Let's put aside democracy. Let's put aside human rights. Let's just talk about legitimacy. You know, what is the basis of his legitimacy as the repression grows and grows, the economy declines? He isn't just jailing people in the Muslim Brotherhood, he's basically jailing everybody. The case against American NGO workers, we're talking about the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Freedom House. We're not talking about a bunch of terrorists, communists or something. The case has been revived just recently. So I worry a lot about Egypt, and the shame of it is that it seems that he's not willing to take advice, or we're not able to give advice that would solve the problem. And maybe next year a new president can start fresh. But at this point, we're patting him on the back for things he's not doing. We're patting him on the back for some things he's doing that he oughtn't to be doing, but he's not actually taking our advice.
Let's have one last question for you, and then we'll end it.
Thank you. I have two questions, actually.
Well, just one.
Okay.
One
I think
question
it
with
was,
two parts.
We had about
There you
5
go.
people that wanted to ask, so just one.
Okay. It was stated earlier that we should be having some policy or reaction as if Paris happened here. What would that look like? And if this room were undecided voters, how would you advise?
Vote Republican. That's the easy part.
So there's a few steps that we could take right now to put much greater pressure on the Islamic State. One would be significantly increase the pace and volume of the air campaign. Not just the U.S. is running, but our allies are conducting as well. Two would be consider the need for augmenting the ground troops we have in Iraq. Anytime you hear people talking about boots on the ground in Iraq, don't forget we already have over 4,000 there. Don't minimize their service. Listen, how many? I mean, the best estimates I've heard would be maybe another marginal, 4,000 to 7,000. Listen to our commanders on that. It's political leaders' job to explain the need for that kind of commitment to the American people and get their support, and to listen to the professional military judgment of our commanders. Third, take our allies' interests more seriously, as I said earlier. We can't expect our allies in the region to take our interests more seriously and commit more resources to it if we're disregarding every other interest they have. Fourth, we really do need to help augment Europe's intelligence and law enforcement capabilities. They have challenges that we don't. Like I said, they're small countries that have smaller budgets. Some Eastern European countries have a government budget that is smaller than Russia's intelligence budget, to give you a sense of scale. They're divided between countries that don't necessarily cooperate effectively together. Internally, they even have some problems like Belgium does, because they're divided linguistically between two different people, and therefore they have rival services. We have the very best and most capable law enforcement intelligence in the world. We need to help augment their capabilities to prevent attacks there, prevent so-called clean terrorists from coming here to attack us here. And we need to be more aggressive in our counterterrorism policies. The president has repeatedly tied the hands of our intelligence officers. Some ways I can't discuss, some ways which are well known publicly. But we need to untie their hands and let them be more aggressive in the collection of intelligence.
I would just on the latter point, I agree with that, and I think we saw this in New York, for example. There's really no police force better than the NYPD. NYPD Intelligence Division is the best of any municipal force. So Mayor de Blasio comes in, and the first thing he does is do a consent agreement that ties their hands, that is essentially oriented toward PC rather than toward security. So, I mean, it was interesting to me that what happened immediately after Brussels. The Financial Times had an editorial. Now, this is a pretty moderate, if not liberal newspaper, saying, you know what we need to do? We need to do more policing in Muslim neighborhoods. Financial Times. Well, of course, they got criticized for it, as some candidates here have gotten criticized for it. But if we're guided by PC, then it's like pulling the you go through the metal detector at the airport, and the 90-year-old lady gets pulled out because they want to be fair and they don't want to profile. So half your police force then goes to fight terrorism in Greek Orthodox neighborhoods. Not smart. So we have to be. I do not think, and I think the New York Police Department record shows this, I do not think that you have to violate anybody's legal rights or civil rights in order to have an effective campaign against domestic terrorism and in order to collect intelligence. It's remarkable that in New York it was not some big court decision, it was the mayor who decided we don't really want to do this anymore. Of course, if, God forbid, there's a terrorist attack in New York, he'll turn around, the public will demand it. But the guide really domestically has got to be our security, not a fear of offending somebody and not political correctness.
And this is another strength that the U.S. has that Europe doesn't. We've always done a better job of integrating and assimilating immigrants of all kinds from all lands to include Muslim lands. If you talk to senior FBI officials, they will tell you that one of the most common sources for leads about potential terrorist attacks here in the United States, or for Americans who have traveled to Syria to train with the Islamic State, or maybe gone to Somalia to train with Al-Shabaab, is Muslim Americans. It's because it's their kids or their neighbors or their fellow mosque members and so forth. Europe, you don't have that. You have neighborhoods like the now infamous Molenbeek, where the police have to wear masks when they enter because of fear of retaliation against them and their families. That's something that's a great source of strength for the United States and something that we need to continue to cultivate.
I would just finish by saying, in 1946, George Orwell wrote a great essay, English and the Politics in the English Language. And language doesn't matter. So if you have the head of the CIA saying that jihad is an act of a holy tenet of self-purification, or if you have the Director of National Intelligence saying that the Muslim Brotherhood is largely secular, or Janet Napolitano talking about an overseas contingency operation, or workplace violence at Pentagon, in that case at Fort Hood, and the president, somebody in the White House at least temporarily edited out the French president's use of Islamic terrorism. If you can't say Islamic terrorism, you have a linguistic problem that reflects an ideological and philosophical problem. And with that, I appreciate all of you coming out, and the Hoover really wants to extend again our thanks to Elliott Abrams and Senator Tom Cotton for doing this conference.